Number 1. Jessie Lee Dotson, Jr. was 33 years old when police arrested him in Memphis, Tennessee, for the killings inside a home on Leicester Street in the Binghamton neighborhood. Months earlier, he had returned to daily life after a long prison term. Court records describe him living with his sister and working with his father as a painter. Relatives later said he carried resentment about feeling forgotten while he was incarcerated. That anger followed a history that already included homicide. In early January of 1994, when Dotson was 19 years old, Hale Ralph Cox was killed during a dispute tied to a drug deal. Dotson later pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received an 18-year sentence. He served about 14 years and was released on parole in late August of 2007, returning to Memphis under strict conditions and the constant risk of being sent back to prison. On Saturday night into Sunday, March 2nd, 2008, Dotson spent hours with his younger brother Cecil Dotson at Cecil's home. Cecil was 30 years old. Also, there were Cecil's girlfriend, Marissa Renee Williams, age 27, two friends, Hollis Seals, age 33, and Shindri Robertson, age 22, and several children including Samario Dotson, age 4, and Cecil Dotson II, age 2. Witnesses later described drinking and arguments building through the evening. The violence that followed was fast and personal. Prosecutors said the conflict escalated into an attack that began with gunfire against the adults. Afterward, the children in the home were assaulted with weapons found inside the house. 3 children survived with serious injuries, but the home went quiet until the next day, when worried relatives and friends realized no one was answering calls and contacted police. In the first hours of the investigation, tips suggested a gang motive. Detectives also said the scene showed signs of interference, including shell casings that appeared to have been gathered up. For a short time, surviving relatives were placed under protection, while detectives tried to separate rumor from evidence. The case turned when one of the surviving children, Cecil C.J. Dotson, Jr., identified his uncle as the attacker. 5 days after the killings, police arrested Jessie Dotson. Court records say he admitted responsibility during questioning, and again in a conversation with his mother describing an argument with Cecil and saying the children were targeted because they witnessed what happened. At trial in mid-October of 2010, Dotson recanted and denied involvement, claiming others entered the home and that he hid and later fled. He testified that he was a gang member and did not call police because gang members do not report crimes and because he feared being blamed due to his past. The jury convicted him of 6 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder. He received 6 death sentences, 1 for each murder conviction, plus 3 consecutive 40-year prison terms for the attempted murder convictions. The Tennessee Supreme Court later affirmed the convictions and death sentences. Jessie Dotson remains incarcerated on Tennessee's death row. Number 2. Natasha Moses Bates, often called Tasha, was a 26-year-old mother in rural Bradley County, Tennessee. She was the primary caregiver for her 2 sons, Leland, 5 years old, and River, 3 years old, on a secluded property outside Cleveland. Court records noted that Bates's mother worked as a truck driver and was away for long stretches, leaving Bates alone with the children much of the time. Investigators later argued that behind that ordinary family image, Bates's life was becoming unstable. Testing showed methamphetamine in her system on the day her sons became critically ill. A toxicology expert testified that after a stimulant high, users can enter a crash stage marked by exhaustion and sleepiness. Officers also recovered evidence tied to methamphetamine production on the property, which prosecutors used to suggest a home environment shaped by secrecy and risk. On Thursday, June 28th, temperatures in the Cleveland area reached around 101 degrees. That afternoon, emergency responders were called to the home of Bates's father, where both boys were found unresponsive. Bates first told investigators the children had been outside playing on a slip-and-slide water toy while she was inside. When a detective went to the property, the toy and the ground around it appeared mostly dry, with only small puddles that had dirt and bugs. As investigators tried to reconstruct the day, Bates's story shifted. She gave different estimates for how long she had been inside, and she described different places where she thought the boys had been. One detail stood out. She said she could not call for help from the property because she did not have a cell phone. Investigators later determined her phone could reach the local 911 center and found it in the trunk of her car. According to court testimony summarized later, on appeal, Bates ultimately admitted she found both children inside her car. Investigators examined the vehicle and heard testimony that multiple door handles were broken or missing, and that some doors could not be opened from the inside. They also described how car seats and a reclined front seat narrowed movement through the back seat area. To understand what that meant on a hot day, law enforcement conducted a temperature study with the car parked in the same location. Even on a cooler day than the day of the incident, the air temperature inside the car reached about 129 degrees by early afternoon. A meteorologist explained how cars can heat quickly in sunlight, acting like a greenhouse and climbing far above the outdoor temperature. A Bradley County grand jury indicted Bates in mid-July of 2012 on charges including first-degree felony murder tied to aggravated child neglect. In late summer of 2013, a jury convicted her of 2 counts of felony murder and 2 counts of aggravated child neglect. The trial court ordered the 2 life sentences to run consecutively, and an appellate court later upheld the homicide and neglect convictions. Bates is serving 2 consecutive life sentences in the Tennessee Department of Correction. Number 3. Lindsey Brooke Lowe was 25 years old when investigators in Hendersonville, Tennessee, began looking into the deaths of her newborn twin sons. She was a college graduate who grew up in a close religious family, and relatives described her as quiet and well-behaved. After college, she became engaged, moved back into her parents' home, and took on extra household responsibilities while her mother recovered from major medical treatment. Prosecutors later argued that Lowe hid her pregnancy because she feared the social consequences of being discovered. Evidence at trial included pregnancy-related internet searches and maternity supplies recovered from her room. Paternity testing showed the twins' biological father was not her fiancé, Jonathan Brooks, and the state pointed to that fact as a major source of pressure. The defense challenged the state's theory and offered alternate explanations involving trauma and impaired awareness during the pregnancy. On the night of September 12, 2011, Lowe went into labor at her parents' Hendersonville home. Accounts presented to jurors described her telling her family she had a stomach illness and isolating herself in a bathroom while her parents checked on her from the other side of the door more than once. She did not ask for help or call for medical care. She gave birth alone. In the statement she later gave to detectives, Lowe said she covered each baby's mouth to stop the crying because she was trying to keep them quiet. Afterward, the babies were placed in a laundry basket in her room. The babies were not discovered until 2 days later, when a family member found one infant in the basket and contacted law enforcement. Officers then found the second infant in the same basket, and the home became a crime scene. Detectives interviewed Lowe and obtained an incriminating statement. Then investigators executed a search warrant and collected physical and digital evidence. Her attorneys argued that her statement and the search evidence should be excluded, but appellate courts upheld the rulings that allowed the evidence. Medical testimony concluded the twins had been born alive. The forensic pathologist testified that the manner of death was homicide consistent with smothering, explaining that in newborn cases the conclusion often depends on the scene investigation and the absence of another clear cause. The defense presented experts who described Lowe as passive and prone to withdrawing under stress, with a tendency to detach from overwhelming events. Prosecutors emphasized secrecy, lack of preparation, and the decision to silence the cries as proof of intent. After heavy publicity, the court used extensive jury screening, and the case went to trial in Sumner County. In March of 2013, a jury convicted Lowe of first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. The trial court imposed 2 life sentences along with additional sentences for aggravated child abuse to be served concurrently. Under Tennessee law, a life sentence requires at least 51 years before parole eligibility, and Lowe remains incarcerated in the Tennessee Department of Correction. Number 4. Frederick Williams was 41 years old when his name became tied to one of Memphis's most painful days. He was an off-duty firefighter, someone trained to stay calm in chaos and protect strangers in their worst moments. People who knew him through work saw a public servant. But behind the front door, reports pointed to mounting instability. Williams and his wife, Stacy. Williams had recently married, and news coverage at the time said he had only just moved into the home. He also had a court hearing coming up on a domestic violence charge connected to Stacy from the previous autumn, adding legal pressure to a relationship that was already strained. As investigators pieced together what happened next, the story became as much about mental health as it was about the crime scene. In later court proceedings, Williams' history of psychiatric treatment was laid out in testimony and reporting. By the time of trial, he had spent years in a Nashville mental health facility and was being treated for paranoid schizophrenia and other issues. His defense argued that his illness warped his sense of reality and impaired his judgment, while prosecutors focused on the steps that unfolded in sequence. On Wednesday, March 8th, 2000 authorities say the crisis turned into a deadly chain of events at the home on Germantown Road. Stacy Williams, a mail carrier, was killed inside the residence. She was 32 years old. Soon after, a fire was set in the home, sending smoke into the air and pulling first responders toward what should have been a standard emergency call. Early reports noted investigators could not say for certain whether the fire was meant to draw responders in or to distract from what had already happened inside. A Shelby County Sheriff's Deputy, Rupert Pete Jr., arrived after being warned there was an armed man near the burning house. Moments later, investigators said Williams confronted him. Pete, 45 years old, was fatally shot before he could exit his patrol car. When Memphis firefighters arrived, they walked into danger they could not fully see. Lieutenant Javier Lerma, 41, and firefighter William Blakemore, 48, were shot as they responded. Witnesses later described Williams shouting for responders to stay back, turning an emergency response into a scene of confusion and fear. Police arrived and ordered Williams to drop his weapon. The confrontation ended when officers fired, wounding him and taking him into custody the same day. In the hours that followed, the city's grief was immediate and public. Funerals and tributes drew large crowds of firefighters, and law enforcement officers and families struggled with the sudden loss made even harder by the fact that the suspect had been part of the same first responder world as the victims. The case moved slowly through evaluations and legal arguments over Williams's mental state. A judge ordered additional psychological testing, including an inpatient evaluation at the Middle Tennessee Mental Health Institute. Williams acknowledged that he shot the victims, but his defense maintained he was legally insane at the time. In late May of 2006, after a non-jury trial with multiple days of testimony, the judge found Frederick Williams not guilty by reason of insanity. He was committed under court order and returned to a secure state mental hospital. Number 5. Howard Hawk Willis was 51 years old when he was arrested in Washington County, Tennessee. Friends and relatives called him Hawk. He worked as a truck driver in Georgia, and by the fall of 2002, his life was spiraling. He was out on bond connected to a New York cocaine smuggling case, and investigators in Georgia were also examining the death of his stepfather, Sam Thomas. People who knew him described someone who could seem friendly and helpful, but who also carried a hair-trigger edge when he felt disrespected or cornered. Adam Crismer and Samantha Leeming were newlyweds, still teenagers, trying to build a future quickly. Adam was 17 years old. Samantha was 16. Testimony later showed Samantha had been staying with Willis's daughter, Kelly, and that Willis spent significant time around the couple. The teens rented a trailer in Rossville, Georgia, in an arrangement that included Willis. To their families, it looked like young love, surrounded by adult chaos with Willis always nearby. On Friday, October 4th, 2002, Samantha's mother saw Willis at a Pizza Hut near the Tennessee-Georgia line. Adam came in looking exhausted and told Samantha that Willis wanted them to leave. The teens left with him, and that was the last confirmed time their families saw them alive. Soon calls went unanswered. Adam's mother later testified that Adam had phoned her upset and crying said he wanted to come home, and then went silent. Investigators later said the killings happened at Willis's mother's home in Johnson City. The newlyweds were shot, and the bodies were later dismembered, with the remains moved to more than one location. Some remains were recovered from Boone Lake, and both victims were ultimately found in a rental storage unit rented in Willis's mother's name. The discovery stunned 2 states at once. A missing teen case in Georgia had become a homicide investigation in Tennessee. Willis drew attention to himself, even as families searched. Court testimony described him calling Adam's mother from a secret number Adam had shared, sounding calm while insisting he had not seen the couple. But on Friday, October 11th, 2002, after a fisherman reported evidence of human remains at Boone Lake, and the investigation tightened, Willis was arrested at a relative's home in Johnson City. A key piece of the case came from Willis's ex-wife, Wilda Gadd. Working with law enforcement, she recorded jailhouse conversations with him. In those recordings, Willis admitted shooting the Crismers. He also offered a motive rooted in resentment and revenge, claiming Adam told him that he and Samantha's brother had robbed and killed Willis's stepfather. After years of delays and repeated conflicts with appointed attorneys, the trial court required Willis to represent himself with advisory counsel. In June of 2010, a Washington County jury convicted him of 2 counts of premeditated first-degree murder and 1 count of felony murder in the perpetration of a kidnapping, and it imposed a death sentence. Howard Hawk Willis remains incarcerated on Tennessee's death row. Number 6. Stephen Ray Thacker was 29 years old when he was arrested in western Tennessee after a 10-day run that crossed Oklahoma, Missouri, and Tennessee. He was a laid-off plumber's helper, married, and according to prosecutors broke just days before Christmas. From the outside, he looked ordinary, a working man with family responsibilities and a shrinking paycheck. But investigators later described a man whose judgment was unraveling under pressure and whose choices quickly turned predatory. In the weeks leading up to the crimes, money problems were front and center. Police said Thacker was searching for fast cash to buy holiday gifts for his wife and her children. Court documents and later reporting also noted he had bipolar disorder and refused to stay on medication intended to stabilize his mood. The crimes began right as holiday stress and financial strain peaked, creating a dangerous mix of desperation and impulsive decision-making. On Thursday, December 23, 1999, Thacker went to the home of Lacey Dawn Hill in Bixby, Oklahoma. Hill, 25 years old, had advertised a pool table for sale. Authorities said Thacker arrived pretending to be a buyer, but his real aim was robbery. Hill was abducted from her home, and she was later killed. Investigators said Thacker used her bank cards afterward, and surveillance images helped identify him, turning the case into an urgent manhunt that spread beyond state lines. Once he was linked to the crime, Thacker ran. He moved into Missouri, breaking into homes while trying to stay ahead of police. On Saturday, January 1, 2000, he entered a house in Aldrich, Missouri, looking for money and a hiding place. The homeowner, Forrest Reid Boyd, was 24 years old and worked as a restaurant supervisor. When Boyd returned and discovered the break in the encounter ended with Boyd's death. Thacker took Boyd's vehicle and kept driving now, leaving a second family searching for answers. The next day, Sunday, January 2, 2000, the stolen car began to fail near Dyersburg, Tennessee. Thacker called for a tow, and Ray Patterson, a 52-year-old tow truck driver, responded. According to the Tennessee Supreme Court's account, Thacker tried to pay with a stolen credit card. When the payment failed, and Patterson realized something was wrong, Thacker attacked him, then took money and other property before leaving. Across the 3 states, the pattern stayed the same: theft flight and a willingness to eliminate whoever might stop him or identify him. Thacker's escape ended when police traced the stolen vehicle to a Union City motel where he had checked in under an alias. Officers arrested him later that same day, and the investigations in 3 states converged into one case file. The legal outcomes unfolded in stages. In Tennessee, a jury convicted Thacker for Patterson's murder and sentenced him to death on Friday, February 8, 2002. In Oklahoma, he later pleaded guilty to kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder in Hill's case, and he received another death sentence in late December of 2002. Missouri sentenced him to life without parole for Boyd's murder. After years of appeals, Oklahoma obtained custody for the execution, and relatives of Hill attended. Thacker delivered a brief apology shortly before the sentence was carried out. Stephen Ray Thacker was executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma on Tuesday, March 12, 2013. Number 7. Paul Dennis Reid, Jr. was 39 years old when he was arrested in Tennessee, accused of a short crime spree that hit fast food restaurants across Middle Tennessee. To people who met him casually, he could seem like an intense but ordinary man trying to restart his life. He worked restaurant jobs, talked about chasing a music career, and drifted between plans. Court records, however, describe a childhood marked by instability, including significant hearing loss from birth and multiple head injuries while growing up. By early February of 1997, Reid had quit his job at a Shoney's in Nashville and had no steady income. In testimony later summarized by the courts, he talked with co-workers about robbing a restaurant after hours, specifically choosing a place and a time when he believed staff would be isolated and easy to control. That mindset, treating a workplace like a target, became a key part of how investigators understood the pattern. Years later, Reid's mental state became one of the most contested parts of his story. The Tennessee Supreme Court described medical evidence that he was brain damaged including a lesion on his left temporal lobe. The same ruling also recounted Reid's claims of elaborate delusions involving government surveillance and remote mind control, while noting testimony that he sometimes told clinicians those delusions were an act meant to serve him. The first attack happened before opening on Sunday, February 16, 1997, at a Captain D's on Lebanon Road in the Donelson area of Nashville. Prosecutors said Reid came in posing as a job applicant. Inside were Sarah Jackson, 16 years old, and the manager Steve Hampton, 25 years old, preparing for the day. Both were killed, and money was taken. Court records estimated that about $7,000 was stolen along with Hampton's wallet, containing about $600. Just over a month later, on Sunday night, March 23, 1997, a McDonald's in Hermitage was robbed as employees were leaving after closing. 3 workers were killed: Andrea Brown, 17 years old, Ronald Santiago, 27 years old, and Robert Sewell Jr., 23 years old. A 4th employee, Jose Ramirez Gonzalez, survived and later testified, describing an attacker focused on cash, issuing strict commands and controlling the room through fear and pressure. The final robbery came on Wednesday night, April 23, 1997, at a Baskin-Robbins on Wilma Rudolph Boulevard in Clarksville. Angela Holmes, 21 years old, and Michelle Mace, 16 years old, were working near closing time. Court records state the attacker convinced them to let him inside, then forced them away from the store. Their bodies were found the next morning at Dunbar Cave State Park, and the investigation widened beyond Nashville. Investigators built the case through witness information records connected to Reid's movements and physical evidence collected after his arrest on Wednesday, June 25, 1997. Separate juries in Davidson County and Montgomery County convicted him of 7 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional charges connected to the robberies and the attack on Gonzalez. Reid was sentenced to death in Tennessee, and he remained incarcerated under that sentence until Friday, November 1, 2013, when the Tennessee Department of Correction reported he was pronounced dead at a Nashville hospital. Number 8. Gregory Scott Hale was 37 years old when deputies took him into custody at his home in rural Coffee County, Tennessee, near the small community of Summitville. Little about his life suggested he would become the center of a homicide investigation that would ripple far beyond his county line. Public reporting at the time described him as living quietly in the area, largely outside the spotlight, until one weekend in early June of 2014 brought investigators to his property with a search warrant and urgent questions. Lisa Marie Hyder was 36 years old. Accounts shared in court reporting described her as a mother, and authorities said she was visiting Coffee County when she crossed paths with Hale. Prosecutors later stated that Hale picked her up at a liquor store in Manchester and brought her back to his residence. Whatever conversation happened in the car, whatever impression he made in those first moments, it ended with Hyder never returning to the people who expected her home. Investigators never presented a simple single motive in the initial charging documents. Instead, what emerged was a picture of fixation and escalation. Prosecutors would later say Hale told investigators he was fulfilling an obsession language that suggested something planned in his mind long before it became real. That detail matters because it points to an internal drive, an idea he carried privately, rather than a spontaneous argument or a crime that began with a typical dispute. On the weekend of June 6th through June 8th, authorities say Hyder was killed at Hale's home. In the complaint summarized by major outlets, a sheriff's deputy wrote that Hale confessed. Officers searching the property found human remains believed to be Hyder's, and Hale was charged with premeditated first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. The abuse charge reflected investigators' belief that after Hyder was killed, her remains were altered and handled in ways meant to conceal what happened. Officials also stated that Hale admitted to consuming part of the victim after the killing, an admission that added a disturbing psychological dimension to an already devastating case. The investigation moved quickly once law enforcement received information pointing them toward Hale's residence. With the search warrant executed and evidence recovered, deputies arrested him the same day. News reports described him being held in the Coffee County Jail on bond set at $1.5 million as the community tried to process a case that felt unimaginable in a place where most people know each other by name. In the months that followed, the legal process shifted the story from breaking news to courtroom reality. The most important developments were factual and procedural, the charge the confession described in the complaint, and then the decision that ended the need for a trial. In mid-January of 2015, Hale pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. A Coffee County judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gregory Scott Hale is serving a sentence of life without parole in Tennessee. Number 9. Cecil C. Johnson, Jr. was 23 years old when Nashville police arrested him for a robbery at a neighborhood market that ended with 3 deaths. At the time, he was working kitchen jobs at Vanderbilt and trying to keep his life on track. Accounts published around his execution described him as the oldest of 10 children raised with poverty and frequent instability. He left school in the 9th grade, married young, and became a father while still figuring out adulthood. On the evening of Saturday, July 5, 1980, Bob Bell's Market on 12th Avenue South was still open in South Nashville. Inside were the owner, Bob Bell, Jr., his 12-year-old son, Bobby Bell, and a mechanic named Lewis Smith, who was working on a boat motor in the store. Court records described a lone gunman entering, pointing a handgun, and forcing Bell and Smith behind the counter where the boy stood. When a woman and 2 children walked in to shop, the gunman concealed the handgun and told the hostages to act naturally and wait on the customers until they left. After the customers left, the gunman ordered Bobby to place money from the register into a bag and searched the adults for valuables. A customer named Charles H. House then stepped into the market and was ordered back outside. Moments later, the gunman opened fire. Bobby Bell was fatally wounded, and both Bob Bell and Lewis Smith survived with injuries. The gunman fled, and Bell heard more shots near the entrance. A taxi parked outside had been hit, killing the driver, James E. Moore, and the passenger Charles House, who court records said was acquainted with Johnson. Johnson was arrested the next day, Sunday, July 6th, after Bell identified him to police. Investigators relied on eyewitness identifications, and the case also turned on a friend, Victor Davis. Early in the investigation, Davis gave statements that supported an alibi. But shortly before trial, after his own arrest on unrelated charges, Davis changed his account and testified for the state under a grant of immunity. He said Johnson left the car near the market, returned carrying cash, and recalled Johnson saying he planned to rob the store and try not to leave any witnesses. He also testified that Johnson later said he had not meant to shoot the child. Prosecutors argued those statements showed planning, followed by panic once the robbery turned chaotic. In January of 1981, a Davidson County jury convicted Johnson of 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with robbery and assault charges, and he was sentenced to death. His attorneys pursued appeals for decades, including challenges tied to witness credibility and the long delay before his execution. The courts denied requests to stop the sentence. While incarcerated, Johnson was also convicted in a separate case tied to the death of fellow death row inmate Frederick Williams in mid-July of 1985. That conviction was later treated as voluntary manslaughter and carried an additional prison sentence separate from the capital case. Clemency was denied, and final legal challenges failed. Early on Wednesday, December 2, 2009, Cecil C. Johnson, Jr. was executed by lethal injection at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. Number 10. Henry Lee Jones, known to some as Bam, was 40 years old when the crimes in this case unfolded, and 45 years old when Florida prosecutors finally indicted him for one of the killings. Born on August 23, 1963, Jones grew up in Cleveland, Mississippi, in a large family shaped by deep poverty. In later court testimony, a brother described a home where older siblings could be violently abusive and where fear and control were part of everyday life. As an adult, Jones drifted through Florida with a long criminal history, including violent felony convictions from the early 1980s background that prosecutors later argued showed a pattern of predation and escalation. By late August of 2003, Jones was moving between states using stolen property to fund travel and avoid detection. Investigators would later trace that movement through credit card use and traffic stops, small routine paper trails that became crucial once deaths in 2 different states appeared connected. On Friday, August 22, 2003, Clarence James, age 82, and Lillian James, age 66, were attacked inside their home in Bartlett, Tennessee, during a robbery. The next afternoon, a family member arrived to check on them and found the front door partly open and the home in disarray, an unsettling contrast to how neatly the house was normally kept. She called 911, and Bartlett police discovered the couple had been killed. Detectives later focused on Jones after evidence suggested the attack involved theft, and that items taken from the home were quickly used and moved across state lines. A key witness for the state was Teverus Young, a homeless teenager Jones had encountered in Florida. In court testimony summarized in appellate rulings, Young claimed Jones brought him to Tennessee, entered the James home, and emerged with stolen property. Young's credibility became one of the central tensions of the case. He was an accomplice witness whose account needed corroboration. Prosecutors pointed to supporting evidence such as the timeline of travel, the stolen credit card activity, and witness sightings that placed Jones and another man near the James residence around the time of the murders. 5 days later, on Wednesday, August 27, 2003, Carlos Perez, 19 years old, was found dead in a motel room in Melbourne, Florida. The Florida Supreme Court later described evidence that someone tried to remove personal items and wipe away traces, suggesting a deliberate attempt to disappear after the killing. Investigators noticed a link that felt too specific to ignore a stolen credit card from Tennessee was used in Brevard County, and surveillance and records pointed back to Jones. Detectives then spotted a white Lincoln with a personalized tag reading 69 BAM outside Perez's workplace, tying Jones's nickname to a vehicle seen in the chain of events. Jones was arrested in Florida in September of 2003. Tennessee tried him first. In May of 2009, a Shelby County jury convicted him and sentenced him to death. But in September of 2014, the Tennessee Supreme Court ordered a new trial, ruling that jurors should not have heard detailed evidence about the Florida homicide as a so-called signature crime. At a second Tennessee trial in May of 2015, where Jones chose to represent himself, the jury again convicted him and returned death sentences. In January of 2019, the Tennessee Supreme Court affirmed those convictions and death sentences. In Florida, Jones was indicted in 2011, convicted in 2013, and sentenced to death in May of 2014. The Florida Supreme Court affirmed that death sentence in March of 2017. Henry Lee Jones remains incarcerated on Tennessee's death row, and he also has a death sentence in Florida,